So this presentation is mostly made up of one that a coworker and I gave at a Montana Racial Equity Project conference. It was probably a couple of years ago. I mean, in the pandemic, it feels like that was about 25 years ago, but I think it was just a couple. And as Simone mentioned, really what this looks at are the groups that have been most active during this time period, the 1980s through 2015. And I try to do this somewhat chronologically, but not surprisingly, I will admit that sometimes that fails. You know, you have groups that their presence kind of crosses over at different times. And I just wanted to echo that point. I mean, I think sometimes it can really feel like, why should we know this history? Especially since this history can be kind of depressing. But I think one of the things I always like to emphasize is, I think over the last 5 years or so, as we have seen this rise in white nationalism, especially in more politically mainstream circles, a lot of people come away with this feeling that, wow, this came out of nowhere, you know, that it's unprecedented. The reality is there is a long historical arc that has helped lead us to where we are right now. And yeah, I'm kind of a research wonk, so I really enjoy this type of history. But at the same time, I think it does help sort of provide that narrative that allows us to see how we've gotten to where we are now. We did decide to break this up into 2 presentations, and 2015 in some ways was a little bit arbitrary of the cutoff to end, but we thought that this piece that could really look at some of the history and then cutting it off about 2015, then the next presentation will look much more at recent history. And so that rise of white nationalism, the rise of the alt-right, the rise of, you know, the Proud Boys, who some of you may have been seeing news reports about the march happening in DC today, and those types of groups. So, you know, hopefully you don't find me too boring and you want to come back for part 2. And yeah, definitely feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go along. I think that's one of the benefits of these Zoom meetings is you don't have to find something to write your question on to hold till the end. You can just plug it in there as they come to you. Ah, there we go. All right. So I want to start with just a little bit about the organization that I work for, the Montana Human Rights Network. So we are a nonprofit that has been around since 1990. Our state headquarters are in Helena. I actually live in Butte. We have, you know, other workers that live in other communities around the state. We have roughly 2,000 household members, and some of whom have been with us really since the beginning. And as I was scrolling through the list of attendees today, I see a lot of names that I recognize from MHRN over the years. So thank you for joining us today. The topic of this presentation really does speak to how and why MHRN was formed. So back in the late 1980s, going into the early 1990s, communities all across the state started to see this influx of white nationalists moving into their community. Up in the northwestern part of the state, it was literally people walking off the Aryan Nations compound in northern Idaho and moving into small communities and setting up shop there. I'll talk a little bit more about this just in a couple of slides, but out in eastern Montana, or somewhat eastern Montana in Billings, you had neo-Nazi skinheads and the Klan that were terrorizing the Jewish community. In Helena, you had a national group called the Advocates for the Pace Amendment. The Pace Amendment was a proposed amendment to the US Constitution that would have said only people that can trace their heritage to Northern European white countries would actually have full constitutional rights. There were many other examples. Those are a few that were going on during that time period. And what happened in all of those communities is people came together. and they were concerned because in a lot of these circumstances, these white nationalists weren't just moving in and like, you know, buying a home and settling down and being quiet. You know, in many cases, they were running for office. They were showing up and testifying at school board meetings. And so it wasn't just like they were coming into the community and being quiet. They were coming into the community and starting to organize. So these little community groups, or these small community groups of concerned citizens, started to pop up in various communities. So we get to 1990, and one of those community groups in Helena had a member at that time, Ken Toole, who some of you may remember that name and was one of our founders. He had a job for the Human Rights Bureau at the time. So the Human Rights Bureau investigates cases of discrimination. And as he was traveling around the state, he noticed that a lot of these community groups were dealing with similar issues that this local group in Helena were. So they helped convene this conference in 1990, and they brought representatives from all of these various groups together. And it was basically kind of a strategy session. It was, you know, what are we seeing? What's working in our communities? What's not working? What resources are out there? What resources are needed? And out of that meeting in 1990 came the decision that there should be a statewide organization that helped communities deal with these types of issues. So thus, the Montana Human Rights Network was formed. So that local group perspective continues to be a big piece of who we are and how we operate. We have about 10 local affiliates around the state. Many of those are based in communities. We have a couple that are more kind of statewide issue-based. But that continues to be a big part of our work. And we really approach our work through what we kind of think is a three-legged stool. We do a lot of work around public policy, we do community organizing, and then we have this Combating White Nationalism, Defending Democracy program that is much more about helping communities dealing with far-right groups like white nationalists and paramilitary militias, and does a lot of research and exposure work about who those groups and people are in our communities. So in our history, we very much started out dealing only with the types of groups I'm going to talk about today. But within a few years, we started to say, you know, it's great. It's great that we're helping communities respond to this, but all we're doing is responding. Like, we're waiting for bad things to happen, and when they do, we come in and try to help out. And the organization made the decision to start working more proactively, especially around policy initiatives. And that while we were going to continue responding to this type of you know, what I would call bad stuff, sorry for the technical term, but, you know, bad stuff in communities, we also wanted to start working to make our communities, to make our state, to make our laws look like how we wanted them to, and that they would work for everyone. So I always like to say we started doing work on LGBTQ equality back in 1992 before it was sexy. You know, and we faced a situation where at that point, you know, even the Democratic Party is calling and yelling at our co-directors and saying, you know, you can't make our people vote on this, you can't make our people vote on this. But, you know, that's when we started to do the work. But this interesting thing happens, that when you're fighting Nazis, everybody loves you. But all of a sudden, especially when we started talking about gay rights back in 1992, 1993, we became controversial. And so you'll still run into people who sort of like part of the work that we do, this kind of work, but may not be as big of fans of some of the other work that we work on. I always like to warn people that as we go through this, you might get depressed, okay? I mean, this is a lot of discussion about mean, disgusting, violent organizations. But I do like to tell people along the way, you'll hear about some of the response work that's happened, and I do wind up at the end talking about some successes communities have had, and also kind of some best practices or lessons learned that we feel like communities can use as they encounter this type of activity. So it starts out kind of gloom and doom, maybe, but, you know, at the end, hopefully, I leave you on a hopeful note, because there is not only a long history of white nationalists organizing in Montana, but there's a long history of our communities standing up and pushing back. So these far-right movements that we deal with all share what we call the far-right ideological construct. This sort of helps explain or kind of gives some frames to look at how these groups operate and what much of their basic ideology is based on. And all of this applies to the white nationalist movement. So these groups, these far-right movements, are all based on conspiracy theories. And they're based on conspiracies that center around the idea that our system has failed or is failing. Now, there can be many reasons for that they plug into these conspiracy theories. For white nationalists, it's generally seen as people of color and Jewish people are chipping away at the system that we as white people built to benefit us. And that people are chipping away at that system and chipping away at kind of that white supremacy and white privilege that we have had over the years. And like I said, generally the enemies are people of color and Jewish people. But it's not just that that system is failing, it's that they are using that system to go after us. So again, it's about these enemies, these perceived enemies that are coming in. They're destroying our system, and they're using that to persecute us. So again, for white nationalists, this is often described in terms, and I'll talk about this more later, but as these Jewish puppet masters that are controlling the government, the media, the entertainment industry, the banking industry, and that they're using that power that they have to go after and persecute white people. These groups and these movements tend to offer really simple answers to complex questions. So I always like to use the example of sort of economic issues, okay? You've lost your job, okay? You've lost your job, you're about to lose your home. Who's to blame for this? Well, trying to understand like this country's economics, international economics, like everything that goes into that huge picture is really hard. But white nationalists come in and say, it's the immigrant that stole your job, and it's the Jewish bankers that are taking your home. So they take these very complex issues that are going on in the world and wrap it into, again, these conspiracy theories where people are trying to take things from you. This construct is based on dualism, okay? This idea that, I skipped access to higher truth. What I mean by that is once you get into these conspiracy theories, people who belong to these groups really think that they're the only ones who really know what's going on and that they have this access to higher truth. They have access to this knowledge that other people don't understand, and that if they could just make other people understand, they would win. And then dualism, this idea that there is inherent right and wrong, good and bad, or in the case of white nationalists, black and white. There is no gray area. Everything can be put into those two categories. And then I've already kind of spoken to this, but that use of fear, that idea that people are out there trying to take things from you. They're trying to take your job, your house. You extrapolate it out. It's kind of like they're trying to take away the American way of life. And also some manipulated nostalgia, where these groups like to talk about trying to return America to a past that never really existed, okay? And if it did exist, it existed because people of color were subjugated, LGBT people were in the closet, and that laws and or violence were used to keep it that way. So even if, that notion that they put out there of nostalgia existed, it's a nostalgia that really only existed for white people. Okay, so you've got this ideological construct, and that, kind of shows or gives an idea of how these groups, including white nationalist groups, impact our communities. And in a lot of ways, it's a frame, it offers some frames for how far-right groups look out into the world and view things. So frames, when I say that, they're just a way that helps people look out into the world and, again, try to categorize complex issues and understand what's happening. Everybody uses them. So that construct is full of frames that far-right groups use. There are also some frames that we at MHRN use quite often. I guess the funnel cloud, maybe it's more of a metaphor than a frame, but we can argue about that at another time. But the funnel cloud is a metaphor that we talk about quite a bit, which is people are always like, how do people get sucked into these groups? Like, for people, like us on the call, it's hard to imagine, why would you find white nationalism, anti-Semitism, racism, all of those attractive? We use the funnel cloud to help try to explain that. So if you think about a funnel cloud, a tornado cloud, up at the end here, and I love with my background, like my arm disappears, up at the top end of the funnel cloud, it's big. It's the big end. So it's pulling people in. These groups and movements are pulling people in for all kinds of different reasons, okay? People love their guns. They don't want to pay their taxes. They're upset about environmental regulations. They kind of hold some racist views. So there's all sorts of reasons that people get pulled into the funnel cloud. Now, some people hang out at that top end, and they kind of hang out there for a while, and then they sort of spin back more into the political mainstream. But as people who stay there start to go down in the funnel cloud, what happens is, and this goes back to kind of that accessing higher truth, they start to only take in information that reaffirms this emerging worldview that they have. Now, people can go, kind of up and down in that funnel cloud. But as you go all the way through, what happens is what pops out the other end is a Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, or many of the recent shootings that we've had that have targeted people of color. If you go all the way through that funnel cloud, what pops out at the end are people who have totally bought into these ideologies and have decided, again, based on kind of that far-right ideological construct, that the people that are attacking them need to be stopped, and they're going to go out and take action based on these ideologies. So I'm going to jump down to the third one really quick. So there are a lot of groups out there and a lot of people out there that think, well, yeah, white nationalist groups, they're dangerous, but really what it comes to is eventually one of their members goes out and blows something up or shoots somebody. So clearly there is a frame around their potential for violence, and that is real. But for us, one of the other really important frames we talk about is margins to the mainstream. Like, it would be one thing if you just occasionally had kind of a lone person, a lone wolf who went out and blew something up or shot somebody. But the reality is, what happens out on the fringe, what happens in the white nationalist movement makes its way into the political mainstream. Now, we used to have much more argument about that than we have over the last 5 years or so. I think the rest of America has kind of woken up to that is something that happens, but that's a dynamic that we have tracked for a long time here. And I decided to have a little bit of fun with this meme that I'm sure you've seen on social media used for other things, where it's like, if that car just kept driving straight out to the far right and out to the fringes and just stayed there, then yeah, occasionally something bad would happen. But as that car consistently veers into the political mainstream and brings those ideas into the mainstream, that's something that we all should be very concerned about. And then finally, the last one is the threat to the democratic process. So white nationalist groups only really want white people to be the ones running things. They have no interest in an inclusive democracy, which I think is what many of us are working towards. And in order to try to keep that democratic process benefiting them, they will use all of these other tools, including threats and violence, to try to keep people of color and Jewish people from participating in our system. And that is also something that we should all be very concerned about. Just a note, so, white nationalism, what does that mean? Probably should talk about that before I can get much farther. And how does white nationalism differ from white supremacy? So white nationalism is this term that actually originated back in the 1960s among white supremacists. And back kind of during and after the civil rights era, it was really used as a euphemism for white supremacy. But by the late 1990s, you started to have this white nationalist movement that's really a social and political movement emerge with kind of its own distinct ideology that really has an emphasis on racism and anti-Semitism and really is focused on the creating of white ethno-states. And so white nationalists in America really believe that America was founded to be a country for and by white people, and that we should be doing everything that we can to try to get rid of people who do not fit that definition. So as a social and political movement, it's an umbrella term that's large enough to encompass what we would consider traditional white supremacist groups, so groups like the Ku Klux Klan, but it also incorporates people who are trying to use, academic sounding language and public policy to push these views. White supremacy, on the other hand, is really that political or socioeconomic system in which white people have a structural advantage, that they have privilege that other groups don't have. So one of the ways I like to think about this that's a little bit shorter and sweeter than that is that white nationalism is a social and political movement. White supremacy is a system of laws that are set up to benefit white people. I mentioned anti-Semitism is a huge piece of white nationalism, and you can't actually separate the two. And here's why. I mentioned, this first idea of white nationalism emerged during the civil rights era. Well, the success of the civil rights movement and people of color, since sets up this sort of disconnect for white nationalists, where they're left wondering, with the civil rights movement especially, how can these people that we have always defined and believed to be inferior, how could they actually make all of these gains and have all of this success when, again, we have always viewed them as inferior? If they're inferior and we're superior, how did they beat us, essentially? And the explanation that they came down to goes back to somebody that has been a frequent scapegoat targeted for centuries. And that is, they decided it must be Jewish people. It must be Jewish people that are these puppet masters behind the scenes, that in this case were engineering the civil rights movement, and these people of color were just their foot soldiers. And to this day, white nationalism views basically any progressive social movement, whether that's a civil rights-based one, whether that's the LGBTQ movement, whether it's feminism, whatever it is, that they view those as creations of Jewish people to try to attack and undermine white people. And again, this scapegoat in a lot of ways made sense because, as I mentioned, a lot of these anti-Semitic conspiracies that exist have been around for centuries. So when we think about white nationalism as a political and social movement, I always think this chart is helpful, and it was designed by our friends at Western State Center. And it helps to get at this idea of that umbrella movement being home to lots of different organizations who use lots of different tactics and lots of different rhetoric. So the way this is put together, in that upper left quadrant, you basically have groups that use more coded language and political legal tactics. And then you go across to the top right, white nationalist groups that use political or legal tactics but use more overtly racist language. And then down on the bottom, kind of the same thing, where you have groups that use more violent tactics over on the left, but more coded language while doing that. And then on that bottom right quadrant, groups that use more violent tactics and are more overt about their racism. And, most of what I'm going to talk about today are groups that fall into that kind of radical violent tactic area and use overt racism. But at the end, I will talk about a couple of movements and some groups that fall into those other areas as well. So the white nationalist movement, it has its own language. It has its own symbols. And some of those stay consistent over time, but others on this list are a little bit dated, but I went ahead and left them in because they're pretty accurate, again, for this time period that we're going to talk about. So, you know, Nazi imagery, Nazi Germany, you know, Nazi, all day long for a lot of these groups. So you see lots of references to Hitler, who is sometimes referred to as kind of a religious prophet. You see swastikas. It's really common to see white nationalists use the number 88. H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. 88 means Hail Hitler. Reference to the Holocaust. White nationalists routinely talk about the Holocaust did not happen. If there are people that will admit that it happened, they will say, well, it happened, but that many Jewish people didn't die. And then the Daily Stormer is a newer one. So it's one of the most popular white nationalist websites out there when it's online. So it's constantly being deplatformed and having to find other ways to get up online. But it's named after an anti-Semitic newspaper that was published in Germany around World War II. And the founder of that publication was hanged at Nuremberg for war crimes after World War II. But so you constantly see these references back to Nazi Germany. The name games one, what I mean there is white nationalists, a lot of them are smart enough to know that burning crosses and using racial slurs and calling themselves white nationalists isn't going to appeal to many people. So they'll use what I like to call these name games. So they'll say, I'm not a racist, I'm a racialist. I'm not a white supremacist, I'm a white separatist. Oh, it's not about white power, it's about white pride. And then a more recent one, identitarian. So this was an idea that was created over in Europe. So European countries, especially around Germany, they don't have things like the First Amendment, okay? And they take Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism incredibly seriously. So white nationalists in other countries sometimes have to figure out different ways to talk about their work. And so this identitarian idea came up in Europe, and it was basically a way for people to talk about how immigrants and Muslims moving into the country were destroying European culture. And so what it comes down to, again, is this idea that your race is your identity, and that there are all of these people of color and Jewish people out there that are trying to destroy that identity. So keywords, the 14 words, again, are referenced fairly regularly still. They stand for, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. These were penned by a guy named David Lane, who was part of a white nationalist domestic terrorist group back in the 80s called The Order. He ended up dying in prison for his role in assassinating a Jewish radio host in Denver. But so you'll see, some people will use like 88 and 14 words, or 88 and 14, like in signing off on emails, or in those kinds of ways. So RAHOA, acronym for Racial Holy War. ZOG, Zionist Occupied Government, or JOG, Jewish Occupied Government. Again, goes to these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that Jews control the government. Mud people is a term used by a religion called Christian Identity that I'll talk a little bit more about here in a second. But again, a term that refers to people of color in that way, and within identity, they really viewed people of color as not even really all the way human. Aryan homeland and things like PLE, Pioneer Little Europe, this area of the country, so the Pacific Northwest, including Montana, has been a targeted area for these ideas of coming in and setting up either a regional homeland, a state homeland, or more like community-based homelands. George Soros references, so that again is more right now. So references to George Soros, the millionaire, billionaire, philanthropist, have become a shorthand way of alluding to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories without having to say it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And then finally, use of symbols, these groups like the Confederate flag, They like to use Celtic symbols, and then you'll also see a lot of kind of Roman and Greek imagery used as well. Okay, so that's kind of a background and an overview. Now let's talk about some of the groups. So the Klan has had a long history going back hundreds of years in Montana. But here's kind of a quick look at more during this time period, what the Klan looked like in Montana. So especially during the 90s and even into the 2000s, we would get Klan literature dropped in local communities. And a lot of times they would reference chapters here in Montana. And pretty much in every case during that time period, these chapters traced back to this guy pictured here, John Abar. And, you know, they had names over the years of like the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, Montana Quest, Realm of Montana, Aryan Nation Knights of the KKK. But those chapters always followed where John Abar was living. So for a long time it was in Billings, and then he moved up to the Great Falls area. Now, Abar never really had a large following, and I think that's a point that it's important to mention, which is the number of hardcore members that these groups have is always pretty small, but it does not take many people with this ideology coming together to cause problems. So who was John Abar? So before coming to Montana, he worked with a Klan group in Wyoming, and he also worked with the author of the Pace Amendment, which I mentioned earlier, going around pushing, trying to get support for the Pace Amendment that would have said constitutional rights only apply to white people. Abar is also a good example of white nationalists trying to use the mainstream political system as a way to recruit and kind of as a public relations vehicle. So back in the mid-90s, when he was attending MSU Billings, he was the leader of the local Young Republicans on campus. The Conrad Burns campaign, one of his re-election campaigns to the US Senate, got in trouble one election cycle because Abar was employed working for that campaign. And then in 2011, he ran as a Republican for the US House. So going back to his activity in Billings, his Klan chapter there, along with some neo-Nazis, were really active in the early 1990s, and by 1993 had really started targeting the Jewish community. And they were vandalizing the Jewish cemetery, there were bomb threats to the local synagogue, and then probably the most famous instance, a brick was thrown through the front window of a local Jewish family. So this ended up leading to one of the most well-known responses to this type of activity in Montana, the Not in Our Town campaign. So this was the one that part of that response was the local newspaper printed a menorah that people tore out of the newspaper and put up in their windows to support the Jewish community, along with a ton of other organizing and public events. So the flyer that I have on here, that's clearly an anti-gay flyer, that was one of Abar's favorite issues to use with lit drops many times, was going after members of the LGBTQ community. I think what I want to point out here is, the Klan always has characterized itself as a Christian organization. And when you think back to the early 1990s, when the fight and the battles over LGBTQ equality were much stronger and a lot more divisive than they even are today, that there were a lot of groups at that time using language similar to what is on this flyer that were considered more mainstream. And that you had, public officials and other, I guess what you would call more kind of religious right groups out there using pretty offensive language. And so Abar, I think, viewed this as a potential way in to recruiting in communities, and again, used language that was worse than what was being used by more mainstream conservative groups, but was not all that far removed. Just kind of finish up on here. I think, the use of LGBTQ issues points out how white nationalists decide what issues they're going to use in communities. They look for hot button issues that are already dividing communities, and then they throw themselves into that wedge and try to recruit. So again, another story here. So there was a guy named Floyd Cochran who lived at the Aryan Nations compound for a long time. He was like their communications officer. He eventually left Aryan Nations and the white nationalist movement. This was back like in the early 90s, and we brought him on a speaking tour in Western Montana. And Floyd would go into these rooms and tell our people, when Aryan Nations went into a community, we didn't talk about race, we didn't talk about anti-Semitism, we talked about the spotted owl. Okay, so this was back at the time when the endangered species protection for the spotted owl was being debated, and people were talking about the impact that was going to have on these small rural logging communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. And I always think that's a good story to tell, just because out of all the things you would think Aryan Nations would talk about, spotted owls probably would not end up on that list. But they used it because it was a hot button issue and it was divisive, and it was already creating that division in the community that they would go in and try to exploit. So where's John Abar now? He has long been going back and forth between whether he's leaving or staying in the movement. So like back in 2002, he said that he wasn't with the Klan anymore because it wasn't effective. But then in 2004, he was the local contact for the Aryan Nation Knights of the KKK. He would also reach out and hold meetings with NAACP groups to try to find what he called common ground. He tried to join our organization. And really, I mean, a couple of our staff members have had quite a few conversations with him. And I mean, I do think that there are some mental issues at play there. The only reason I bring that up is because I think that's where so many of us want to go. We want to think, okay, the only people that could be attracted to these groups must have mental illness of some kind. In John Abar's case, I think that that holds true, but I think it's important to know that isn't always the case. And I think that it's kind of a shortcut that a lot of us try to use to explain away why people join these organizations. So the next group I want to talk about is Aryan Nations. And a lot of people are familiar with Aryan Nations, but that was like the political arm of the group. The religious church part of the group was actually called Church of Jesus Christ Christian. Because again, think about it, for white nationalists, they're Christians. How could you talk about Jesus if Jesus was a Jew? So clearly, Jesus had to be a Christian. So that was the name of their group, Church of Jesus Christ Christian. And it's based on this theology called Christian identity. And identity is based on a racist and anti-Semitic interpretation of the Bible. So it teaches that the lost tribes of Israel actually settled in Northern European white countries. Therefore, that means that white people are God's chosen people. Jewish people in many of the narratives are literally the offspring of Satan. And as I mentioned before, people of color are considered really subhuman, what they refer to as mud people. So Aryan Nations was a major driver in the Pacific Northwest back, in the 80s and the 90s especially. And it really had an impact here in Montana, because you would get people who were affiliated with the group, sometimes who had lived at the compound in northern Idaho, that would move over here to Montana. And in some cases, they moved because they had theological arguments or disagreements with Richard Butler, the founder and leader of Aryan Nations. Otherwise, a lot of times it was just ego. People would get in these little personal fights and they would leave. But we ended up, for a while, we had a Church of Jesus Christ Christian Montana that were made up of former leadership in Aryan Nations that moved to Montana. And then there was also another group called Church of True Israel that were people who had been members of Aryan Nations and its church, and ended up moving to Montana and setting up their own shop. I want to spend just a little bit more time on Aryan Nations because it was such an important driver of what happened in this region and in Montana during those times. So Richard Butler moved Aryan Nations up to northern Idaho in mid-1970 and established his compound there. And what this signaled was one of the first big pushes to try to make that idea of an Aryan homeland in the Pacific Northwest a reality. That had been something that was talked about before, but Butler coming to northern Idaho, building a compound and encouraging people to come to this area really made that a again, feel like maybe this could actually happen. Now, they targeted this region due to demographics. A lot of the states in this area have, a big white majority of people. For politics, the states tended to be a little bit more conservative, and the availability of land. Now, the idea was to get white nationalists to come to this area, build critical mass. Eventually, they'd be able to take over local city governments, and then state governments, and then multiple state governments, and create this Aryan homeland that would secede from the rest of the country. I'll talk a little bit later about how this idea has been scaled down over the years through something called Pioneer Little Europe efforts that are more based on trying to do that, but just at the community level. So clearly this never worked as a strategic plan. But I always like to say that that idea of this area of the country still lives in white nationalist myth and lore. And what I mean by that is you can go on any white nationalist message board, website, social media, congregating area, and find white nationalists waxing poetic about wanting to move to Montana or Idaho or Washington or one of these states. Has nothing to do with them having any family connection or anything like that to the area. It's because this idea of an Aryan homeland in this area still exists. So other Aryan nations and other Christian identity groups were really major drivers of white nationalism and what it looked like during the 1980s and 1990s in this region. And because of that, our communities, this region, we understood that connection to anti-Semitism and white nationalism very well. Because as I mentioned, Christian identity, it's very clear that they hate people of color and they hate Jewish people. And because of that, I think, those of us that do the kind of work I do, but also a lot of community members understood that connection. I thought it was really interesting. Some of you may have heard presentations by Eric Ward. So he's the head of Western State Center. He got his start in this work when he was in college in Oregon. He worked in Oregon and Washington. We brought him to Montana a lot. And then eventually he moved to the Midwest, and then he went into philanthropy and ended up on the East Coast. And he was telling me one time, it's really amazing. When I did my work here, people understood that anti-Semitism and white nationalism couldn't be disconnected from each other. But he said the farther east I moved, people didn't automatically see that connection. And I actually think that one of the reasons for that was because of the presence of identity here in Montana and the region. But another thing that identity really influenced was the formation of militia groups and the so-called Patriot movement of the 1990s. So again, for those of you that may have been around, you may remember back, in 1990, going into the early 90s, these militia groups were really building steam in Montana and other places. But I mean, we're talking about militia groups with militia in their titles drawing hundreds and hundreds of people to these public meetings. And again, for a lot of people, it felt like, where did this come from? This is brand new. Well, it came from the white nationalist movement, and especially in this region, a heavy dose of Christian identity. So when you look at the leaders and the architects of that movement, and especially those in this region, they came out of that hardcore white nationalist movement. And these are just a couple of examples. So John Trockman, founder of the Militia Montana, he's the center person there pictured. He and his family were identity adherents, and he had actually spent a decent amount of time at the Aryan Nations compound in northern Idaho. Later, when he got the Militia Montana going and people called him out on that, he would always say, I only went there to try to make them better people. Richard Butler's response was, you helped us draft our code of conduct. So clearly there was a relationship there. But another one, Bill Greitz, who is pictured there on the bottom of the slide, was another very influential militia leader who was also an identity adherent. And that list just goes on and on. Now, what these early leaders recognized was that their reach as in the white nationalist movement was limited. Okay, burning crosses and racial slurs turns most people off. And so the founders of the militia movement wanted a vehicle to mainstream white nationalism that could work closer to the political mainstream. But again, the white nationalist movement played a key part in their development. So first, they took pieces from the Posse Comitatus. This was a white nationalist group back in the 1960s that actually influenced Richard Butler of Aryan Nations quite a bit. He attended an identity church down there that was run by the guy that got the posse going up in the 1960s. They also used the Ruby Ridge, Randy Weaver standoff in northern Idaho back in the early 90s. And what they did with this is they were able to test out and kind of cement this emerging narrative that they were pitching, which is the federal government is willing to kill its own citizens for having what they like to call non-mainstream views. And that what we saw at Ruby Ridge and later Waco was how the government was going to impose its will on kind of non-traditional thinkers, or true patriots, as they called themselves. So again, Randy Weaver and his family had moved to northern Idaho, lived close to the Aryan Nations compound, where identity adherents and Randy Weaver had spent time at Aryan Nations. Then following the Weaver standoff, an identity pastor in Colorado named Pete Peters convened what he called a meeting of Christian men at Estes Park. And so this was back in October of '92. And at that meeting, there were basically 160 or so white nationalists and other leaders from other sectors of the far right and even more closer to the mainstream that came together to talk about basically how can we leverage what happened at Ruby Ridge. And it ended up being a strategic planning meeting. And one of the outcomes of that was this decision that we should create militia groups and the militia movement. And instead of focusing on anti-Semitism, we should talk about how this movement is about protecting constitutional rights. So the framers of the movement really just took the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the white nationalist movement, took racism and anti-Semitism out and plugged in guns and taxes. I mean, granted, it was a lot more complicated than that, but that's essentially what they did, is they took a lot of white nationalist ideology, tried to strip out the blatant anti-Semitism and racism and plug in some different keywords. And it worked, okay? Back in the early 90s, you had these militias recruiting and engaging people who were much more part of the political mainstream around these conspiracy theories that, while rooted in anti-Semitism and racism, lots of people who were signing up had no idea. And I think that I always like to point out that continues today, okay, except we're even a few more iterations away from those racist roots. But when you look at militia groups today, like the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters, they have those same racist roots. This is their history. Okay, so kind of back to the timeline. Aryan Nations started to have a real decline in impact going into the late 90s. So in 1998, Aryan Nations guards from the compound chased down this mom and her kid in a car, shot at the car, forced the car off of the road and assaulted them. They did this because the car, when it went by the compound, had backfired and the Aryan guards thought they were under attack. So the mother retains the Southern Poverty Law Center and files a civil lawsuit against Aryan Nations. Aryan Nations loses the case, is hit with a $6.3 million amount in damages. Butler ends up having to sell the compound. The philanthropist that bought the compound has it razed to the ground. Jump forward a few more years later in 2004, and Butler dies at the age of 86. This is a good point to talk about another factor in the white nationalist movement. I always like to say that white nationalists don't have a good racist management training program. And here's what I mean by that. Often these groups start or are formed by or kind of rise to the top under a certain person and personality, in this case, Richard Butler. When that person steps aside, dies, is arrested, whatever the case may be, oftentimes there's nobody to step in and fill that gap. So Butler had named a few successors over the years, and not surprising, you're not dealing with high-quality individuals. You had one of them who was a convicted cop killer, and another one who had been convicted of fraudulently obtaining veterans benefits. But there wasn't really a clear successor when Butler died. So again, what happens often happened here. The remaining people around start fighting amongst themselves about who gets to carry on that mantle, who gets the resources, all of those types of things. And so you had this incredibly influential group throughout the 1990s that was really done for all intents and purposes by, as you get into the late 2000s, 2010s. There's still some chapters and activists around that try to claim that mantle, but it is absolutely nothing like it was back in its heyday. So as Aryan Nations dies, there's this vacuum created at the national level. But again, what becomes this recurring theme is that someone is always willing to step in and fill that vacuum or fill that vacancy. So the group that ends up doing that is called the Creativity Movement. And the Creativity Movement is interesting for quite a few things. So we've talked about Aryan Nations and the Klan, who both referred to themselves as Christian organizations and had their own takes on theology related to Christianity. Some groups are really overtly hostile to Christianity in any version. And one of those groups is the Creativity Movement. So Ben Claassen, pictured here, was a former Florida state legislator, and he developed what he called creativity. And he had a patent on one of the early versions of a can opener that made him some money. So he self-published, I think there's about 8 books in total, and printed up thousands of copies of them, but where he outlined what creativity was known for. And it's called the Creativity Movement now. There have been a couple of court cases where they've had to change their name over the years, but so it's the Creativity Movement now. In the past, it's been the Church of the Creator, or the World Church of the Creator. And so what is the basis of creativity? Basically, Ben Claassen said, white people have created everything that has ever been good about civilization in the world. And so the followers of this religion call themselves creators. So on the slide here are some of their other beliefs. So our race is our religion. Again, that sounds very much sort of like the identitarian thing we talked about. The white race is nature's finest. Racial loyalty is the highest of all honors, and racial treason is the worst of all crimes. So racial treason would encompass any interaction you had with somebody who wasn't white. And then the Creativity Movement was the one that pioneered this idea of RAHOA, or racial holy war. So as I mentioned, Claassen was overtly hostile to Christianity. He viewed it as what he called it a quote-unquote spooks in the sky religion. And he said that Christianity was created by Jewish people to trick white people into focusing on an afterlife so they wouldn't realize and understand what Jews were doing to them in the here and now. And again, most of what kind of supported creativity, when you read through his books, again, are these long time, sometimes century-old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So we've had creators in Montana for decades, both while Claassen was still alive, and then eventually Claassen commits suicide. And what happens is that national group splinters into state-based or regional groups, with Montana being one of the strongholds. So about the time Aryan Nations is getting in trouble, you have a guy named Matt Hale, who is in the top picture here on the left with kind of the smug look on his face, which I would argue is how he looked most of the time, becomes the leader of the Creativity Movement. And he is named leader at a gathering held outside Superior, Montana in 1996. Now, Hale was a law school graduate. He normally liked to wear suit and ties. And he was really a master at political theater and was good at getting media attention for his group. I often say that Matt Hale was the alt-right before there was an alt-right. So Matt Hale takes over in 96 because of his skills, especially sort of in racist public relations. The Creativity Movement is really rising. And so as Aryan Nations falls, Creativity Movement is there to fill that void at the national level. And again, we saw that reflected here, where all of a sudden the creators here in Montana were kind of the big thing going. Then we get to 1999. And Benjamin Smith, who was a creator, had been named Creator of the Year, their highest honor, was working at church headquarters. And I always like to say church headquarters was in the basement of the home that Matt Hale's mom lived in, but was, working at church headquarters, went on a shooting spree in the Midwest. He ended up killing 2 people and wounding many others. And this started what ended up being the decline of the creativity movement. And by 2005, Matt Hale was sentenced to 40 years in prison for trying to have a federal judge killed. But going back to the Montana creators, as I said, we'd had them for decades, and really before and after Hale's leadership. So back before Clausen committed suicide, again, the problem of not really having a strong racist management training program, he had named multiple people as potential successors, one of whom was a guy named Rudy Stanko, who lived down in the Billings area for a long time. When he was named as a possible successor, he was doing a stint in federal prison for selling tainted meat to school lunch programs. So again, a very high quality individual. We also had 2 very long-time activists here in Montana, Dan Hassett, who is pictured in the top photo there on the right, and a guy named Slim Deardorff. They had been reverends in the group for a long time. Slim's main function was that he had a really kind of crappy wooden shack outside of Superior, but had some land where they could have these summer gatherings that they had most years. Hassett, on the other hand, was a regional director for the group. He had been named Creator of the Year. He was also in line to possibly succeed Matt Hale when Matt Hale left. So Montana becomes this incredibly important outpost during Hale's time. And really, especially as legal trouble mounted. So there are stories that as it was looking like Hale was going to be convicted, he converted a bunch of church funds to gold bars that then were sent to Dan Hassett to bury on Slim Deardorff's property. As far as I know, no gold was ever found. But again, internal fighting erupts. And as Hale starts to lose kind of his grip on the group and maybe headed to prison, Hale ends up kicking Dan Hassett and Slim Deardorff out of his group in 2002. Hassett and Deardorff say, hey, we were here before you, we're the true creators. They started their own splinter group, Church of the Creator Northwest, that kept on for a while. We take great pleasure, and we kind of helped destroy that group. There was a guy who wanted to leave the group and leave the white nationalist movement that contacted us. And kind of going back to Ben Clausen's thing about, racial treason, anybody who's in the movement, who leaves the movement, is the worst kind of person. And so he needed to get out of the state. So he contacted us and he said, if you guys could give me a little bit of money to get out of here, I will sell you all of the Ben Clausen books that we have. And so we did our checking to make sure, like, if we bought these, they couldn't come back to us and say that we had bought stolen property, so we checked all that out. We eventually ended up doing that and got about 4,000 copies of Ben Clausen's books. But what that did is it left them no way to raise money. And so the group pretty quickly went bankrupt. Slim Deardorff was old and eventually passed away, and Dan Hassett kind of moved on to other things. So there's kind of this lull then around that time for about 5 or 6 years where the creativity movement again kind of has splintered into these regional and state groups. And then all of a sudden, starting around 2008, 2010, we see the second iteration of creators in Montana led by a teenager in Billings named Alan Goff. And again, we started to see the vandalism and literature targeting the Jewish community and people of color in Billings. Goff worked really hard to set up some chapters in other communities. He ended up being charged with shooting another teenager, but ended up not being convicted. But again, he claimed he had been active in the movement since he was 13 years old. And he had been active with a group in Billings called the Montana Front Working Class Skinheads that for a while patrolled Pioneer Park and made it a whites-only area. And because of that activity that involved physical violence, a lot of those members ended up going to prison. But that was sort of how Goff got his start. Around that same time, a guy named Craig Cobb walks across the border from Canada into the Flathead area and sets up shop. And at that time, he really identified as a creator as well. He worked with some other white nationalists up in the area to show Holocaust denial and kind of German Nazi propaganda films at the library. And we were lucky with him. He and a lot of the white nationalists headed over for the Bakken boom to get jobs over there. But we ended up doing a lot of work, a lot of research work, a lot of kind of exposure work with the Not in Our Town Billings, and really were able to kind of break apart Alan Goff's chapter and his groups, down there as well. So we've gone from the Aryan Nations to the creativity movement. And again, so the groups here on the ground are struggling, if not going inactive at this time. Matt Hale's going to prison. It opens up a spot for another group to take the lead. And William Pierce and his National Alliance were very well positioned to do that. So William Pierce had a doctorate in physics. He had taught at Oregon State University in the early 60s, but by the late 60s, he had left academia and was working for the American Nazi Party. And then after that, he transitioned into working for Youth for Wallace, which was a group at the time dedicated to the runs for president by segregationist governor of Alabama, George Wallace. Jump forward into the 70s, he had renamed that Youth for Wallace group the National Youth Alliance, that then he eventually calls the National Alliance. Pierce is an interesting guy to look at because he really created his own white nationalist empire. So the group had a compound, doesn't every self-respecting white nationalist group need its own compound? They had a compound in West Virginia, but he had a book publishing company called National Vanguard Books that sold books and tapes and all sorts of other materials. He recorded this radio program called Dissident Voices that was basically his racist and anti-Semitic interpretation of current events that he would send around and sometimes manage to get on the air at AM radio stations. And then in the late 90s, so I think it was 1999, he acquired Resistance Records, which at the time was the biggest white power music company in the country. And he did that specifically, he wanted that to help recruit young people. Kind of in the same vein, he helped start the development of some of the early white nationalist video games, one of which was called Ethnic Cleansing. So through all those ventures, the National Alliance made money. And when they took over Resistance Records, that was a company that was making, $1 million in revenue every year. So they had lots of money. So he was well positioned with the National Alliance to sort of fill, again, that national leadership gap, which he did. And kind of interestingly, those creators that Matt Hale kicked out in that leadership dispute, one of the things that he claimed was that Dan Hassett and Slim Deardorff had approached William Pierce and asked him to take over the creativity movement. So I mentioned before kind of the white nationalist roots and the racist roots of the patriot movement. William Pierce kind of adds to that as well. So under a pen name, he wrote a book called The Turner Diaries. And the book tells the tale of Earl Turner's band of racist revolutionaries that were fighting a futuristic war, which at that time was taking place in 1991. So the Oklahoma City bomber I mentioned earlier, a militia adherent named Timothy McVeigh, loved this book and actually sold this book at gun shows occasionally to make a little bit of cash. Well, the book, which the National Alliance called a, quote, handbook for white victory, has served as a blueprint for violent actions really ever since it came out. Including, I mentioned David Lane, author of the 14 Words, and that group, The Order. The Order really kind of followed this book as a guide. But these passages that are on this slide talk about Earl Turner using a truck bomb to blow up an FBI building. And when you go through and you read that book and you go back through and read about the bomb that Timothy McVeigh used to blow up the federal building, and given the fact that he loved the book, that's another interesting connection there. So again, those creator chapters in Montana are kind of in flux or diminishing. So there's a leadership gap, again, here in Montana. Well, as William Pierce filled that nationally, we saw that filled here in Montana with the young guy pictured on the right here named Kevin McGuire. So Kevin McGuire sort of started his white nationalist activity as a student at a college in California, where he convinced the local newspaper to run this anti-Semitic column he had written. And there was this huge controversy over it, and it sort of made him a minor celebrity for a few months in the white nationalist movement. He would eventually move to Helena, and he was really pretty quiet there. And then he moved down to Bozeman to attend MSU. And all of a sudden, these sizable literature drops start happening in Bozeman and in other communities. He had kind of a handful of local supporters. Again, he was a pretty young guy, so he was busy trying to recruit other young people. They would hang out near schools, especially the high school, kind of handing out white power music CDs. They held some rallies in and around town. Earlier, they were pretty small. They'd every once in a while get up to 15. Again, about a handful of those were actually local people. Other people were from out of town or out of state. But sometimes he showed up alone. And this photo on the bottom here is he showed up to protest outside of a Montana Democratic Party event in Butte. And what's going on in that picture is some peace protesters had also showed up at the event. And over time, they just kind of surrounded McGuire so you couldn't see him or his sign. But McGuire was really active, and as it shows there, he ran for the Bozeman School Board. He finished last, but it's a little bit scary. By that time, we had helped everyone know who Kevin McGuire was, and he still got like 150 votes. But again, because of the work, we had a local affiliate group called the Gallatin Valley Human Rights Task Force that we did with that group, and that we did, initially uncovering that it was him doing the lit drops, and all of that public exposure made things pretty hot for Kevin McGuire in the Bozeman area, and he would eventually move to Idaho. And voila, once he moved, the National Alliance activity that had been going on didn't happen any longer. So again, just back to the national level really quickly, 2002, William Pierce dies. The National Alliance continues on as various leaders in that group fight for those money-making pieces. But really, by about 2010, it was pretty much over. That also, interestingly enough, is the year that Kevin McGuire got arrested over in Idaho for handing out Aryan Nations literature. So a lot of times these activists change over time and may move to different communities, but they continue to be active. Okay, so that brings us up to like the 2010-ish time period. And that is about the time here in Montana that April Gady, who's pictured in that bottom photo, started a chapter of what's called Pioneer Little Europe, or PLE. So you might not remember April Gady, but you may remember around that time the Nazi Pop Twins. So her twin daughters that are pictured in that above photo, who performed as a group called Prussian Blue, which was the name of the gas used at the extermination camps during World War II. So while Prussian Blue was kind of the hook and got a lot of the publicity, April Gady had a long history in the movement of her own, including being a member of the Creativity Movement and the National Alliance. So when they moved up here from California up to the Flathead area, she started campaigning and recruiting for a PLE. Now the PLE is basically an Aryan homeland at the community level. So again, a state, a region trying to adopt or make that happen strategically wasn't going to happen. I mean, people realized that. So this PLE effort was meant to do that on a community level. So get like-minded people to move into a community. Once you have enough people, you take over that community. So that's really what April was trying to do here. And, her primary pitch, again, was one that you hear often. Montana is overwhelmingly white. It's generally pretty conservative and fairly libertarian. In other words, people generally tend to be kind of live and let live. And land and property can be pretty cheap. I mean, not necessarily in the Flathead, but that was kind of one of the pitches. And also, we tend to have very lax laws around firearms in the state. So sort of all of those were pitches that she would use. And over the years, she was able to get about a dozen or 20-ish people to move up to the Flathead area to be part of this PLE. And, they did like sort of group events, like they post these videos of like PLE out on Flathead Lake during the summer, like these kind of recruiting videos. But they also helped with Craig Cobb, who I mentioned earlier, show these Holocaust denial and pro-German Nazi films at the library. So she's recruiting, some people are moving up to this area, but guess what? It turns out that people who can pick up and move all of their position all of their possessions at a moment's notice and move aren't necessarily of the highest caliber. So this story gets repeated over and over. April recruits somebody. They move to the Flathead. They move in with April for a while. Everything is wonderful. She's showing them around. She's sometimes helping them get a job. Like, Montana is white. Montana is great. And then inevitably some sort of personal argument happens. And they fight, and they fight on social media, on Facebook, in between each other. There's a feud that happens, and all of a sudden, April is the worst person ever. They're bad-mouthing each other. So it wasn't always a very cohesive group. But the reality is she was getting white nationalists to move to the area. So in more recent years, Getty has kind of backed off this approach. I think some of it has to do with some personal health reasons, but the other thing is some of those people she brought up here are highly unstable. And one of those people developed a really dangerous obsession with April's youngest daughter, to the point that she's had to get restraining orders against him. And so I think part of it, is health issues, but part of it is, I think, she's sort of sick of these people that she's helped recruit to the area. But a lot of those people are still kind of kicking around in the Flathead area, still doing lit drops, still, kind of recruiting, not necessarily at the level that April has, but people to move up to the area. But this story has a somewhat happy ending. So the Prussian Blue, her two twin daughters, as they got older, they have left the white nationalist movement. They have condemned what they did while they were Prussian Blue, and really it sounds like don't have a huge relationship with their mom anymore. And we think that one of the reasons for that is up until they moved to Montana, they had been homeschooled. And there's a documentary that shows April homeschooling the youngest daughter, where she's teaching her the alphabet, saying A is for Aryan, B is for blood. That's the education that her twins were receiving at home. When they went to the Flathead, they started going to public schools. And we actually think that receiving a real education, meeting new people and different kind of people really helped start them on the road to where they are now, which is not part of the white nationalist movement, and not just not part of it, but will talk and speak publicly about how sorry they are for what they did while they were Prussian Blue. Oh boy, I've been talking too much and too slow, so I'll try to pick up the pace here. Okay, so I mentioned before, these groups have been predominantly in that quadrant of that early slide on the overt racism, violent tactics. But there are groups that fall under the white nationalist banner here in Montana that are a little bit more in that political legal tactics and coded language quadrant of that diagram. And one of those is the anti-Indian or anti-Indigenous movement. So that movement really has two main points. So the first big one is eradicating tribal sovereignty, getting to the point where treaty rights are not honored at all, and basically getting rid of tribal governments. So that's like the one that is the easiest to see. But the other piece is what they would euphemistically call assimilation, which is, Indians, indigenous people, they are conquered nations, therefore they should have to assimilate into white culture. They should leave their native culture and their native history behind. And one of those arguments is, you shouldn't concentrate on the fact that you're a tribal member. You should focus on that you're an American citizen. So this definition down at the bottom, we released a report back in 2000 that was really the first look at this movement here in Montana. And we said that the movement was racist because it was an effort to deny legally established rights to a group of people who are identified on the basis of their shared culture, history, and tradition. And not surprisingly, members of that movement were not happy with that characterization. And a leader of a group here in Montana sued us over the report. Short story on that is we eventually settled. We didn't have to change any of the report. But during one of his depositions, he actually agreed with our definition that as it applied even to indigenous tribes. So we're like, oh, must be a pretty good definition. Like, they don't like it that we're using it, but even this leader agrees with it. So ever since we released that report, we would get questions about whether or not we thought these groups should be categorized as hate groups, like by the Southern Poverty Law Center and other groups that do that kind of work? And our answer was always yes. But again, starting around 2015, 2016, as more organizations, more organizers, the media started to use that hate group term more often, we ended up releasing this report that the little photo there is of, where we really tried to lay out our case for why we think anti-Indigenous groups should be categorized as hate groups if that terminology is being used. So this is another movement, because of its not overt racism, that it works really easily with both far-right groups and more mainstream groups as well. This slide is just a really quick overview of the main groups that have been active in Montana over the years. And really what happens is anytime you see a tribe trying to exert its treaty rights, you will find these groups popping up to oppose them. So a couple of fairly recent flashpoints have been around the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes, efforts to get management over the National Bison Range that's on the Flathead Reservation, and then to get their Flathead Water Compact ratified. Now what's been interesting is these groups come from the right, but those groups down at the bottom, especially the Citizens Equal Rights Alliance and This West is Our West, have really gotten into this pretty heated, nasty battle with U.S. Senator Steve Daines, who has introduced legislation to ratify the Flathead Water Compact and transfer the Bison Range back to the tribes. For years, the biggest sort of activist here in Montana is this woman named Elaine Willman, and I think these Facebook posts help show that connection to the harder white nationalist ideology. So this one, you are white. Your ancestors did not steal this country, they built this country. In a weird way, that sort of ties back to this notion of Ben Clausen and creativity, where white people are the creators of civilization. And then you have this other one, when is White History Month, that has this fist up in the corner that says 100% white, 100% proud. That is a slogan and an image that you find sold on t-shirts and all sorts of other white nationalists and pretty overt neo-Nazi, materials. And what's interesting is, so this is Elaine Willman, another activist that's been around in Montana, a guy named Skip Palmer, shared that same When is White History Month thing on Facebook, and happens to also be the son of another longtime anti-Indigenous activist. So the kind of the last one to mention is anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-Muslim work in Montana. I throw all of these together just because here in Montana, it's sort of hard to pull them apart. In other words, the same groups and activists engage on all of these fronts. And often, especially currently, it's sort of this conspiracy theory that says all people of color who are migrants or refugees are actually part of this secret plot by Muslims where eventually they're all going to rise up and destroy America. So Paul Nachman has been, one of these consistent activists. I'm going to skip over some of this, but worked for quite a while as a physicist at MSU, had a long history of activism, especially on anti-immigrant issues in California before he moved to Montana. He's worked to try to get the Sierra Club over the years to adopt anti-immigrant positions by trying to stress overpopulation and birth rates and those types of issues. Writes occasionally for this website VDARE, that stands for Virginia Dare, which white nationalists claim is the name of the first English white child born in America. And then he's affiliated with a group called FAIR, which is the Federation for American Immigration Reform. That's really the big national organization that does this work. And he has a chapter here that's called MILE. And let's see, I'll kind of skip down to Last Chance Patriots. They're a little bit newer group, but they started out as Flathead Act for America. So they were a Montana chapter of Act for America, which is the largest anti-Muslim group in the country. And for a couple of years, they paraded anti-Muslim speakers through Montana. They generally start in the Flathead and then go to other communities. They eventually changed their name to Last Chance Patriots, I think mostly so they could be more overtly political, and they weren't hemmed in as much just to work on anti-Muslim issues. So now that continues to be something they do. but they also show up and work on other issues, including anti-Indigenous work. Okay, I swear I'm very close to being done. So what this proves is that white nationalism has a long history in Montana. That's the story that often gets told. That's what, especially it feels like media outside of the state love to focus on. What gets lost is we as Montana communities have a long history of standing up and fighting back. This picture was actually from, and if you come to the second one of these, I'll talk more about the Nazi troll storm and all that happened up in Whitefish around 2016. This was a sign that showed up at one of those events that I've always liked. It would be even better if Zieg was spelled correctly. But my point here is Montana communities have not just rolled over and said, oh, I guess they win. You know, we have this long history of pushing back. And the key to this is you find your people. You find people who are concerned about this activity, you come together and you organize. And I just wanted to talk about one summer that I think is a great illustration of how these response activities can work. So this is the summer of 1999. This is the summer where Matt Hale was going to be coming out in September for their annual meeting in Superior. And this was literally months after Benjamin Smith had gone on his shooting spree in the Midwest. So the communities of Superior and Missoula had been used to responding to this type of activity. But that presence of Benjamin Smith, and the shooting sort of upped the tension about the creators meeting in Montana this year. So both Superior and Missoula designed responses, and I'm proud to say that we were part of both of those responses. So in Superior, people rightly so were concerned that what if somebody that comes to this gathering decides to emulate Benjamin Smith and goes on a shooting spree? So they were faced with sort of this idea of safety, but they wanted to do something. And they knew that previous times they had done counter-protests where like the creators would line up on one side of the freeway entrance, counter-protesters on the other, but they also knew that a lot of the times the creators were carrying guns. So they made the choice, and we talked with the local ministerial association, that they wanted to do something, but they didn't want it to be at the same time as the rendezvous. So we helped them organize something that was called the Day of Harmony. And it happened about 2 weeks before the creator meeting was going to be happening in Superior. It allowed them to proactively, and before the creators came to town, send a message that Slim Deardorff, Dan Hassett, Matt Hale, the creativity movement, did not represent what they viewed as good community values. And it let them do that in a way that did not set up where you were going to have potentially a confrontation between community members and armed creators. Missoula took a slightly different approach. So Missoula, they were concerned because of Benjamin Smith, but they were also pretty angry. They were fed up of Dan Hassett constantly doing anti-Semitic and racist lit drops in their community. They were mad at, basically, the racist and anti-Semitic shenanigans he had done over the years. And so they decided they wanted to do something different, and they wanted to do something a little bit edgier. And so we ended up working with our local affiliate in Missoula, and we had a block party on the street where Dan Hassett lived. And we had a couple hundred people that showed up, had, Big Dipper, donated ice cream. We had ice cream, we had some food, we had a band. And the way we talked about it was, look, the community wanted to do something to celebrate community and to celebrate the real values of the community. But we also want to make it very clear to Dan Hassett, that we understand he's the one that's doing this in our town, and we're not happy about it. So we have this block party. The highlight for me was when Dan Hassett comes out wearing dress pants that he had clearly just bought at a store because the tags were still on them. But during the night, he gets into this discussion with an elderly woman and is trying to explain to her how the Holocaust didn't happen. Well, this woman, it turns out, had been part of the Dutch resistance to the Nazis during World War II. And so that was really interesting exchange to sort of hear happen. And he also seemed really mad that we didn't throw him out. I think he thought he was going to show up and we were going to tell him to go away. But we were like, hey, if you want to be here and mingle with people, like that's fine. The reason I like to use this summer is I think it can sometimes feel like there's a cookie cutter approach that should work. That there should just be sort of a template that you can use in each community. But the reality is we've learned over the years that responses and work in communities have to involve those community members. That's kind of a duh. But they have to be responsive to the needs of the community and to what they think is best for the community. Superior and Missoula that summer were literally responding to the same group, the same activists, and the same problem, but decided to do it in very different ways. Again, this is kind of the lessons learned part. To be successful in Montana, you have to build cross-issue, cross-constituency movements and do that kind of work. So what I mean by that is we have to get out of our single-issue silos. Liberal organizations, sort of the progressive movement, have too long been organized in single-issue silos. So we do human and civil rights work here, conservationists do work over here, women's rights groups work over here. In Montana, to win and to be successful, you have to work across those issues and you have to develop those relationships. But those relationships take time, not just between leadership of those organizations, but talking to the members of those organizations and explaining why that cross-issue work is important and to explain how those issues connect up and work together. And also in this work, Montana is a huge state. You've probably noticed that. But you have to develop local leaders. You have to find those people in communities that care about what's going on and give them the tools and the skills that they need to be able to do the work. We obviously believe that local human rights groups can build a base of support by kind of bringing to these situations education, providing research, working on proactive measures, and then doing that cross-issue organizing to build relationships. Now, we've talked about most of these, but the proactive measures, that goes back to what I talked about MHRN going through early on, which is it's fine and absolutely needed to respond to these bad things happening in our communities, but we also should be working to develop what our vision of our communities are, what we want our communities to be, and doing that kind of work as well. Here are just some resources on our website I wanted to make you aware of. So we have this online reporting form where you can report to us when you see this type of activity in your communities. That's really helpful for us. We have a rapid response guide that is on another slide that you can also find that's kind of an infographic about, okay, if this is going on in your community, what should you do? And you can also sign up to get our action alerts and things like that. And again, you can find all of that on the homepage of our website at mhrn.org. And then finally, I know, I started to wonder if I was ever going to stop talking too. We've gotten to the last slide. Here's some more resources. I mean, if you're interested in reading more about these topics, there's our website again. Over on the right is kind of a squished picture of that rapid response guide I mentioned. Western State Center is a group that we work with a lot that's based out of Portland. The Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights is another group that we work with. We actually just worked with them to issue a big report about Ammon Bundy's new ventures called the People's Rights Network. Political Research Associates, they do a lot of really good work on this from a national perspective. And then there's always the Southern Poverty Law Center. So with that, I'm finally going to stop. I apologize for going long. You might have noticed I like to talk about this stuff a little bit because I think it's important. But yeah, Simone, why don't we go ahead and start doing some questions? And thanks everybody.
That was really interesting. A lot of good information, and we have some really good questions in the chat too that I'm excited to hear the answers to. But if you don't want to stick around for questions, just let me quickly tell you about our next event, which will be part 2 of this seminar, and that'll be addressing what these groups are doing currently. So that should be really interesting and super relevant to what's going on right now, you know, the current political climate that we are experiencing right now. So that'll be on December 5th, so in 3 weeks. And you should see an email in your inbox with a link to register for that. It should be in your inbox now. So if it's not, you can also find it on the Facebook page.